All right, friends, welcome to In the Movement. So this is a webinar series that we do at Equal Justice USA. My name is Sam Heath, and I'm the manager of what's called our Evangelical Network. So Equal Justice USA is a national organization of about 30 people, and we work to repeal the death penalty and to think about what would a transformed criminal legal system look like. What does transformed policing look like? How do we engage with racial equity? How do we incorporate restorative practices into all pieces and places when there is harm? And each month we have someone come on this In the Movement webinar who is in the justice movement. And the goal is to engage and elevate different people's voices and their work. And so today we have Dr. Jemar Tisby. Jemar, it is great to see you. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here, man. Look, this is a heavy topic, but you're one of the people I most enjoy talking about it with. So it'll be oddly enjoyable, even as we talk about some of the most terrible things that are happening in our society right now.
Right. It's like saying you really like the movie Schindler's List. Like it is wonderful and weighty at the same time. Awesome. Well, let me tell everybody some things about who you are, and we'll dive right in. So I like how you've described yourself and your website. It captures author, speaker, historian, and those capture three really big pieces of your life, right? You're the author of 3 books, including the best-selling The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity and Racism. That was the first thing of yours that I read. You're also a speaker. You speak in many national spaces at conferences and colleges and universities and webinars like this. And you're also a historian. You got your PhD from the University of Mississippi, and that's a huge piece of your story. And I'm sure some of that will come up as we talk. So you also have a family, and there's so many other things, but especially you'll be bringing that author, speaker, historian piece of you here. So jumping right in, this is something I've heard you say. It strikes me, and I think it captures a lot of your work. Are we in a new civil rights movement?
It feels like it. It's dangerous for a historian to pontificate on the present. We focus on the past, but I look at race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century, specifically the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. And there are all the elements now that we saw in movements of the past. There are urgent issues. There's the repealing of rights and the opposition to progress. There are distinct, quote unquote, sides to the things that are happening. There are instances of, in particular, police brutality. All of the elements that we saw in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s that went into this massive social upheaval around racial justice in particular, we have those now. And for me to say we're living in the modern day civil rights movement, whether historians 30, 40, 50 years from now actually characterize it that way, what I hope is that people understand the time to take action is now. If you're waiting for some moment, some movement, well, guess what, baby? It's already here. Right now is the time to take action. And the question is, what are you waiting for? If you haven't already, what more needs to happen? How many more need to be killed? What more injustices do you need to see? How much more urgency do you need to feel in order for you to acknowledge that, yeah, right now we have to do something?
I know some people ask the question of, or they make the statement, if I was alive in the civil rights movement, I would have been marching on the streets and doing that. And it was several years ago that I was confronted with that thought and in part my hypocrisy of it. And it helped catalyze me and my family more into some spaces with it. But a lot of it is sparked by certain incidents and moments, right? And if we mark the first civil rights movement, either by Emmett Till or Brown versus the Board of Education,
that's right.
How are we marking things now? Right. I know you said it's hard for historians to speak about things in the present, but there seems to be some consensus around when this iteration of things restarted.
There are a few key moments. I am of the persuasion that we are the Trayvon Martin generation, as some have put it, because that murder in 2012 put back on the radar in terms of a national conversation, in a new way, in a fresh way, the idea of racism still being a present issue and a deadly one at that. Now, what was, quote unquote, missing from that murder was video. Then we get in 2014, the killing of Mike Brown. That was significant because the Black Lives Matter phrase, slogan, movement became the ideological, rhetorical banner under which the current movement marched forward. But then we had further incidents of police brutality in particular that were caught on cell phone video from in particular one that stands out to me is Philando Castile broadcasting live. His girlfriend specifically said, "Don't shoot my boyfriend," and many other incidents. So all of those are part of it. For me, a big one was Trayvon Martin, and then Mike Brown, because we started saying Black Lives Matter. We started hearing from other people, in particular, other Christians. Well, Blue Lives Matter, all lives matter. That's a communist movement, those kinds of things. So that brought to my attention in a fresh way just how far we still had to go in race relations in the church. And then that is all aside from Trumpism and what occurred in the lead up to the 2016 presidential election, and then the years following when Trump was president, which also was revealing in many different ways.
Let me pause here and say for anybody who just joined, we'll pause at the end for a few minutes. If anybody wants to ask questions of Jemar, you can type them in the chat or you can type them in the Q&A, and we'll get to those at the end. So absolutely, you can jump in and participate that way. So you've talked about it in other places, the significance of this statistic: 81% of white evangelicals voted for Trump in both elections. Why is that significant, and what does that mean for us, or what does that reveal?
I can definitely talk about it on a macro level, but let me talk about it on a personal level. So I, at that time, attended a predominantly white evangelical church. There was some racial diversity, and I, for the most part, felt comfortable there. It was a time when you could be of very different political persuasions, but that wouldn't necessarily come up in conversation or sort of day-to-day interactions. What was different in 2015 and 2016 leading up to the election was these issues came to the forefront, and you sort of had to proclaim where you landed, because Trump was such a polarizing figure. You know, he said you can grab women by their, you know what, and they love it, right? They'll let you do it. He had a record of racial discrimination in his real estate dealings. He was a birther, demanding that Barack Obama, President Obama, show his birth certificate, right? So to be in support of this guy, whether you were a conservative or not, that spoke volumes. I didn't know where the rest of my church members were prior to the election, but when that 81% number came out, I knew, based on existing information and what people said, that many of my fellow churchgoers had voted for Trump. And it's not to say that you can't have different political persuasions, but what it did for me in that moment was say, these people don't know me at all. It said, these folks who I've prayed with, who I've sang with, who have held my child, who have had meals with, they don't understand my reality as a Black man, or our reality as a Black family. And it really hurt me that we could share this sort of intimate space of a faith community, and yet my concerns, my priorities, my fears even weren't really even a consideration. And so I said on a podcast the subsequent day following the election, I didn't feel safe going to my church. I didn't feel safe, not physically, but emotionally and spiritually, to go amongst people who it almost felt callous, a callous disregard for what was a very existential reality for me, and being so proud and so excited about the election of this individual who represented honestly so much moving backwards in terms of what we were trying to do to promote racial justice.
Walter Kim, the president of the National Association of Evangelicals, I've heard him talk about the season that we're going through as a church, capital C, is a sifting right now. And
Mhm.
both of these narratives that we're talking about, and in some ways they're competing narratives, are what brought that about, right? With the rise of Trump and what's happened surrounding him, the Black Lives Matter movement as well. These have come into the church and have created this great sifting. And you're speaking about some of the real implications of how those
That's right.
things have come about.
That's right. That's right. We're using the same language. I also use the language of sifting. But listen, we're dealing with issues of moral clarity, and I need people to recognize that context matters. What we're dealing with, 2016 and beyond, at least, is different than what we dealt with before. So it's issues like, do masks help prevent the spread of an airborne virus, or don't they? Was the 2020 presidential election lawful and legitimate, or was it stolen? Like, these things are you have to pick a side.
Mm,
There's no in between. There's no both sides on it. So what that has done in the church is, as people have chosen a side, whether they verbalize it or not, you can tell by their actions. As people have chosen sides, you have some people saying, this isn't what I thought it was or what I wanted it to be, and it's not for me anymore, so they're leaving.
mm,
You have other people going toward places that are sort of the most extreme. There are pastors who have built a national reputation and have grown their churches to mega churches by parroting the most extreme lies and myths and untruths, because there are some people who want to hear that. The Bible talks about itching ears.
mm,
And so there's a sifting, and that doesn't mean so people are sorting themselves. And
mhm,
I don't think that's actually that bad, because most people will say, oh, the church needs to be unified. But we need to be unified around truth.
mhm, mhm,
So it doesn't do us, it's not even true unity, it's conformity.
mhm,
If we remain together, but we sacrifice the truth. And so it could be that as this sifting occurs, those who remain dedicated to the truth at great cost might be the remnant, might be the mustard seed, which the church
mhm,
has always been in its
mhm,
truest form. And don't be surprised to see churches large and growing that are not committed to those same principles, that are trumpeting the same kind of misinformation and even conspiracy theories that we see in our politics, because the two, unfortunately, are very related.
mhm. I'm reaching back to my days when I taught AP psychology, and I'm thinking about the idea of an in-group bias. And so much of what
Wow.
we see happening is just a reinforcement of an in-group bias that's happening. And I think it is important to distinguish between unity around what? And
Right,
that's key,
right.
right?
Yes,
Because individuals and churches are being so confronted with truth, it's a season of revelation of where you are with that.
exactly.
I want to reach back before all this, because I know some of your background is that you were a teacher for a season,
Yeah.
and more than that, talk to us about what that was and how that plays a role in how you bring content to audiences and engage people now.
That's so great. I have this new office that I love. It's something that could only happen in the Delta and its cost of living. I'm on the top floor of the tallest building in town, downtown, in the corner office, overlooking the main street downtown, which literally the next block is the school where I taught. That's how I got
Wow.
down to the deep south. So I get to see school's going to be starting up here soon, and I'll get to see
Yep,
the
for us
kids
too.
again. So education for me was actually a justice awakening.
Mm,
I live in a rural county in Arkansas, in the Delta, which means it's right along the Mississippi River, eastern part of Arkansas. It was listed in terms of uh, income as the fourth poorest county in the United States.
mm,
Now, this has a direct link to history, because this is literally cotton country. So the generational poverty that we're seeing among the community, which is majority Black, is due to the legacy of race-based chattel slavery. After emancipation, we never got the 40 acres and a mule. We never got the means of economic stability that others had. And then that led to sharecropping, which was debt peonage, It led to mechanization in the 1950s, which led to unemployment, the exodus of companies out of the area. And so now the poverty rate in my county is 41%, which is double the state average. And the state average is even higher than the national average. So what we're talking about is one of the poorest places in the country. So I came down here as an educator. And when you're an educator in a low wealth community, you do so much more than teach content. There's a store here called Myrna's 2 blocks from the school. We would go there every month and buy dress up clothes in case the students came to school on dress up day and they didn't have, couldn't afford the proper attire. We're a school where under federal assistance, if you reach a certain threshold, some of your students can qualify for what they call free or reduced lunch. They can pay a reduced price for a federally provided lunch, or they get it for free. Once you cross a certain threshold, think around like 75 or 80% of your students meet that requirement, your whole school gets free and reduced lunch. Like, it's just, they're basically like, you've got so many low wealth students there, we're just going to give you all the lunches for free. Don't worry about it. We're one of those schools. So we're having to worry about, whether students are coming in having had adequate food for the day, because if you're hungry, you're hangry. You can't learn. You can't learn. We had students with such emotional issues, oppositional defiance, depression, suicidal thoughts, that the best thing I ever did as a principal was hire a full-time therapist, full-time counselor. And they weren't about, college placement or high school. It was literally social emotional learning. And we had some kids who had to go straight to the counselor every morning, because if they didn't, you could say the wrong thing, look at them wrong, and they would pop off. And that was just because they didn't know how to regulate. They had so much going on in life as a little kid. That's what's so, we were in middle school, 10, 11, 12-year-olds facing homelessness, parents incarcerated, drug use, violence in the community. And then they come in and you expect them to teach, the capital of Massachusetts. What? So anyway, that was, for me, you have to, it forced me to say, what does my faith say about this? What is the fact that I'm a Christian? And by the way, we got a church on every other block here, and we're still facing all these issues. What does that, what does Jesus have to say about all of this? And I found, because I had been in these white evangelical Protestant Reformed communities, I didn't have the tools to really understand these material, physical, existential, urgent issues from a theological perspective like I wanted to. So it set me off on a journey to try to understand faith and justice.
I wanna quote from, it's an early part of The Color of Compromise, and it's my favorite line in the book. You say, history and scripture teaches us that there can be no reconciliation without repentance. There can be no repentance without confession, and there can be no confession without truth. And it sounds like a lot of what you had in that teaching and principling experience was a confrontation with truth, and then this season of mourning, and then a season of confession, maybe even on a corporate level, and then what then is required of me, and that movement into action. But that arc that you articulate is key. Brian Stevenson says it another way. If he says that truth and reconciliation are sequential, right? That there's an order to those things, that one has to come before the other, that there must be truth telling, and there must be an explanation of why things are the way they are.
That's precisely right. And we have done such an incredible job of creating propaganda around our past, creating a mythical past. This is the whole Gone with the Wind phenomenon. It presented race-based chattel slavery and antebellum society as this perfectly well-ordered, harmonious, functioning culture of aristocratic plantation owners, happy Black slaves, right? And we've done the same with other eras. With the Jim Crow era, it has become about signs over drinking fountains. When what Jim Crow was about was the systematic disfranchisement of Black voters in particular. It was about keeping certain people out of certain jobs and in certain jobs, right? So when we look at the federal assistance that came during the Great Depression, the way FDR got some of these measures passed was to make a deal with Southern politicians that said two groups of laborers would be excluded from these benefits. Those were agricultural workers and domestic workers. So who were those? Sharecroppers and essentially maids to help, right? Which were predominantly Black people, particularly in the South. So that's what Jim Crow is also about: violent terrorism in the form of lynching and also rape. So that's how we've sanitized the past. Even Martin Luther King Jr., right? He gets weaponized against racial justice by saying, well, King was colorblind. He said he wanted his kids to be judged by the color of their character, the content of their character, not the color of their skin. No. That was in the context of a much broader speech in and of itself, in terms of the speech he gave in 1963, but also his broader message and ministry about equity and justice.
And ultimately a call for reparations.
Absolutely.
And a call for repair.
Some type of redistribution.
I think about my friend Greg Thompson. He wrote an article for Comment Magazine, and I'm butchering the title, but it was Martin Luther King Jr., the friend we need but do not want. And essentially what it went through and showed us was just what you have said. We have sanitized, others have said whitewashed King, and appropriated him in a way of making him a mythical figure, rather than here are his words, here are his goals, here's the context that this piece came from. He is far more complex and far more demanding, as is Jesus, than we might actually know. Certainly than we're told.
Absolutely.
You mentioned Jim Crow. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. So just back to the truth telling. It's a big term. Okay, start with history. If you don't know where to start in history, start with what you think you know best and go back and revisit it. So for instance, the civil rights movement, we think we know about the civil rights movement, but really it boils down to one day a little old lady refused to give up her seat. There was a boycott. Martin Luther King gave a speech and racism was over. That's the common, I mean, if you really dig down to it, that's what most people sort of off the top of their heads know about it. So guess what? Go back, read a biography of MLK, shoot, even watch a documentary, right? To get some of the complexities there. Go back, read a book on the civil rights movement in your state. One of the big things I say is start locally. History is a big field. It's expansive, right? So where do you begin? Begin locally. Why is your county named what it is? Who is the person who that building is named after? What is the history of your city or your state during the Civil War, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, all of these movements? There's all these ways to begin telling. Be ready, because the truth
you'll find it.
Will cut.
I read Wendell Berry's, I think it was 1969, his book, The Hidden Wound, which so much of what you're saying about the agricultural workers and movement and what that's done, he articulates there, but it's about race at the end of the 1960s and his processing of it. And he says, you need to know your land and what happened on it. And it prompted me to research the land that we lived on. And we found racially restrictive covenants, one from the 20s, one from the 40s. And I remember sitting in the archives room and feeling my first reaction was this embarrassment of looking around of, oh, I own this land and it's been bequeathed to me and this is its past and its history. And it forced us into this reckoning. But things like that are all over. As you said, if you look at what you know, there's more there. And you talked about Jim Crow, and that's another era that I think that you're right. We've trivialized it to signs over drinking fountains, but this was new to me, and this is something you taught me many years ago. What happened on Stone Mountain in Georgia in 1915?
Okay, this is how the past informs the present, because we're talking about white Christian nationalism. Finally, now it's in the headlines, right? But it's not a new phenomenon, and this melding of race and religion and politics has always been present. And so, what happened on Stone Mountain, Georgia, Thanksgiving Day, 1915, is a perfect example. Many people don't realize that the Ku Klux Klan had several iterations. One was immediately after the Civil War, the other was during the Civil Rights Movement, but the one in the middle, during the Jim Crow era, was in many ways the most violent and widespread iteration. That revivification of the KKK happened in 1915 when a white former Methodist circuit rider. So he was a preacher, led a group of white men up to the top of Stone Mountain, Georgia, which is a bas relief of so-called Confederate heroes, Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, Jeff Davis. And they went on top of Stone Mountain. They did a few things. One, they burned a cross, which is a throwback to a Scotch-Irish ceremony. They built an altar. And on that altar, they placed 3 objects. They placed a flag, a Bible, and a sword. Now think about the symbolism: a flag, a Bible, and a sword on an altar. Okay, so the flag, that's nationalism. It's the idea that there is something called a quote unquote true American who is, in their view, in 1915 and in many ways today, a white, preferably Protestant, but certainly Christian person. Male is preferred, but women are part of it too, to a degree, in a patriarchal way. And then native born, US born, rather than an immigrant, English speaking, all of those things, right? This goes
Distinguish patriotism and nationalism,
so
because those are not
patriotism,
synonyms.
correct. Patriotism is a natural affinity toward one's country. It's you rooting for your home team, right? Like it's not necessarily antagonistic to others simply because they're other. It's just that this is home, this is familiar, you want the best for it. And in contrast to nationalism, it wants to expand. It wants to expand rights. It wants to expand voting. It wants to expand a multiracial democracy. Nationalism is this again narrowly construed identity of who is truly American and therefore who truly has access to certain rights and privileges. So it's narrow. It contracts. So you've got the flag, you've got the Bible, which means there's a divine permission for what these folks are doing. You can't dissuade them with mere facts. No, this comes from God. This is, and then the Bible, the word of God. By the way, there's a this is just Jemar speaking, but I think there is a tight correlation between constitutional originalists and their hermeneutic and the hermeneutic of biblical literalists reading the Bible. So they take both the Constitution and the Bible as sacred documents. And some will even go so far as to say the Constitution is essentially divinely inspired. And even if they wouldn't use that language, they treat it as such. You can't touch it.
Right. Authorial intent. That's a dissertation. Somebody needs to.
I'm saying. So there's a parallel there. And then here, last thing, they put a sword up there. Today, it might be an AR-15. It's the use of violence to enshrine it's a hierarchical system. So I appreciate that callback to that, because that's the KKK is an explicitly white supremacist organization, and yet we see some of the very same symbolism and ideology among politicians, pastors, theologians today.
There was an article in Sojourners on August 12th, so just a few days ago, in honor of the anniversary of what happened with the Unite the Right rally here in Charlottesville in 2017. And the woman who was writing it, Amanda Tyler, she's with the Christians Against Christian Nationalism group. She was saying, I didn't have the language for it then, but I have the language for what that was now. And she goes through, and the whole article is on white Christian nationalism. And she details, here's what it is, and here's why it is important that we label this now. We have to term this correctly. As you said, it's been here, but now we have this language for it. And now it's becoming more common. And that's right, within some public spaces.
They're also trying to redefine it. So you'll see folks like Marjorie Taylor Greene say that, yes, I'm a Christian nationalist, and that's a good thing. They're trying to change the connotation from what it is, which is really a very bad thing for democracy, and I would say the witness of the church, to something that's a positive good. So this is why it's incumbent that you tune into conversations like this, that you follow the work of Equal Justice USA, and that we equip ourselves to understand what these terms and definitions, both Christian nationalism, critical race theory, and other concepts, what they truly are, because they're constantly trying to be redefined and co-opted by folks who want to sanitize them and make it out as if they're not as bad as they really are.
You talk about language. So how do you use the term and find the term racialization helpful?
Yes, so I get that
rather than maybe racism.
Right. So that's from where I learned it. It was Divided by Faith by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. Classic text,
Mhm.
over 20 years old, but so still very relevant today. And they talk about racialization in terms that says most of the most important life outcomes still fall predictably along racial lines. You can look at life expectancy, access to healthcare, level of education, uh, infant mortality rates, maternal mortality. All of those fall predictably along racial lines, even now in the 21st century, after the Voting Rights Act, after the Civil Rights Act, after all of these changes that we've seen in society. This inequality by race still persists. That's helpful because a lot of times when we say racism or the society is still dealing with racism, people immediately default to personal attitudes and opinions. Do
Mhm.
I call someone the N word? Do I have friends of different races? Right. And the problem with that is if that's your definition of racism, then hardly any people are racist, right?
Mhm.
Simply
Mhm.
from demographics, we kind of interact with different people, or we've been raised right or go to church, so we're not going to overtly call anyone a racial slur, most of us. But is that really all there is to racism in the United States, a nation that had at its core the idea that people were property and could be used as such, right?
Mhm.
No, racism goes much deeper than that. So the ideal of racialization says that our society has been structured around these ideas of race that afford different benefits, privileges, advantages to certain racial groups that others don't get. And
Mhm.
so if we look at it from that lens, we can see how this is still an issue that is persistent, urgent, even deadly, and that we have to address right now.
Mm. When you say some of the things that you've just said in spaces, especially prioritizing both the individual and institutional pieces of racism, what are some common objections that you get? I know you list some of these in your book, and there's a typical 4 or 5 that often come about, and it's so important to name those and talk about those, because some of them on a surface sound like a call towards something good. Obviously you can name them, but I'm thinking with what I just said of let's just preach the Bible, right? Let's
Mm,
just focus on Jesus. And the idea of just, that word,
mhm.
it just negates all before.
So in the 1790s, the Baptists in the Northeast made an attempt to, as a denomination, as a group of churches, to repudiate race-based chattel slavery. And so they actually came up with a document that they, at their like annual convention, that they then sent to the local churches. Well, there was such a backlash at the local church level, particularly around wealthy white people who enslaved people, that once the sort of national body heard about it, they're like, okay, actually, on the slavery question, that's a political question, and the
Mm,
church doesn't deal with that. So we're just going to stick to the spiritual stuff. Or as we might say today, we'll just preach the gospel. So there has long been this bifurcation and this segmentation of this specific issue of
mm,
race as a secular, political, social issue that is somehow outside of the purview of the church and its spiritual mission. I was part of a Presbyterian denomination, and they had in their tradition something called the spirituality of the church,
mm,
which says that the church's function is ministerial and declarative. It is not to get involved with politics, and there's absolutely some truth to that in terms of separation of church and state. But the way they deployed it was as a theological end around addressing the most urgent social issue of the day, which
mm,
was racism and white supremacy.
mhm,
So we still use that today, is what I'm
mhm,
saying. When people
mhm.
say that phrase, just preach the gospel or just stick to the Bible, which by the way has been used against me many, many times, even among members in my own congregation. What it is saying that that issue is too divisive, it's too disruptive. We don't want the status quo to change that much. Let's not talk about it.
Right, right. I'm thinking about a Presbyterian denomination this summer that voted to pull out of the National Association of Evangelicals. And part of why they did was they put in their document, quote, civic intermeddling, and and accusing, meaning the denomination of, or the NAE of doing this, of equating these things and collapsing these things rather than just preaching and focusing on the gospel.
And if I'm remembering right, the president of the NAE is part of that denomination.
He is. He is. Yeah, layers upon layer, right? So another term, when we were talking about language, do you use the term or find helpful the term reconciliation when talking about matters of race?
Reconciliation is a Bible word, so for that reason, I'll never not use it. But what I do is distinguish between the way that word has been deployed in the what I call the evangelical racial reconciliation movement. I would call that movement as something that started in the late 80s, early 90s, and went on to about Trayvon Martin. It really began to crumble around then. But for that period, there was this big push for racial reconciliation in the church. So you had what they called the miracle in Memphis, where historic Pentecostal, one white, one black, came together and tried to reconcile. You had Southern Baptists finally in 1995, I think, repudiating their origin as a pro-slavery denomination. You had all of these, you had Promise Keepers doing, making this big deal, one of their pillars, racial reconciliation, right? And then you had the growth of multi-ethnic churches, more multi-ethnic churches now than 30 years ago, right? There's been an increase in that, but yet and still there was a flaw in it. The flaw was a very narrow understanding of racism and the racial crisis in general, which was what we talked about before. It was mainly individual and interpersonal. So what did the racial reconciliation movement focus on within evangelicalism? It's getting people together. Let's have coffee together. Let's do a pulpit swap. Let's hire the worship pastor of a different race or ethnicity, right? Let's have visible diversity. Let's have interpersonal friendships and relationships, and we'll solve the racial crisis one relationship at a time. That is the slogan of Mission Mississippi, a racial reconciliation organization. But that doesn't really do it, right? Like Sam, you and I,
none of those things is wrong.
No, none of those things is wrong. You and I can have a great relationship, and it can be extremely fulfilling and enriching, and I can learn from you and you can learn from me. And that's great. I'm not saying not do that. But that's not going to change the fact that Black women die in infant mortality related incidents at 3 times the rate of white women. That's not going to change the fact that when we have a viral pandemic, some people have easier access to healthcare than others. It's not going to change the fact that people locked up in the carceral system are disproportionately Black and brown and poor. Right. So I use the term racial justice to get at those bigger systemic and institutional issues, because racial reconciliation has the connotation of, well, let's just all be friends. And that's what we need to do about racism.
I'm thinking about another common objection that you mentioned earlier that's come up, of the accusation of engaging in Marxist communist ideology. And I'm thinking about that same denomination that we've been talking about. In 2018, they released what they called a racial and ethnic reconciliation report. There's a lot in there that's incredible and beautiful, and I've sent that report to dozens of people, but there is a line in there that talks about wanting to eschew anything that relates to Marxist communist ideology. And none of that is a far step from critical race theory, right? And I was listening to the episode of you and Tyler on Pass the Mic talking about it, and you said something, and I literally pulled the car over and typed it into my phone to make a note of it. And because I wanted to bring it up here, and it struck me and captured something that I think I felt and didn't have words for. You said, with this opposition that's been happening, and an anti-critical race theory crusade is the language that you used. You said, this vehement opposition that's there is not about what you have done or said, but about what you threaten. So what is that? What is this felt threatening? What is it that people feel is being threatened when people talk about institutions or systems, or we have to move beyond an individual lens of race?
So we can look at individual components. What's threatened are positions, what's threatened is power. But ultimately, what I think is the issue is that what is threatened is a narrative.
Mm.
What is threatened is the story this nation has told itself about race and about how society should be structured along those lines. And so when we come, what critical race theory does is question the narrative of a colorblind legal system that treats all people equally, regardless of their racial or ethnic background, which we know is not true. You can look at the data, you can look at the simply look at incarceration and convictions, right?
Mm.
And see that that is not accurate. So, but when you bring that up, you threaten the narrative of uh, this racial progress that the nation has supposedly experienced. And don't get me wrong, there has been progress, but many people who feel threatened would say it's essentially been uninterrupted, almost inevitable
Mhm.
progress, that things will just get better on their own
Mhm.
without without activism, without
Mhm.
protest, right?
Mhm.
It also threatens a narrative of white innocence that even apart from my own intention or malice towards someone, I may not have it, I can still be part of a system that advantages some and disadvantages others. And by being passive and accepting the status quo, I am somehow, in some sense, participating in upholding that system.
Mhm.
And so this is where you'll hear a lot of anti-CRT critics in their like policy language. They'll say, we object to any teaching that says any race or gender is inherently bad. And what they're trying to get at with that language is their erroneous idea that simply being white, literally the melanin in your skin, makes you a bad person. That's not what anyone is saying. It's
Right.
not what CRT scholars are saying. What
Right.
they're saying is there's a racial narrative
Mhm.
that puts white people at the top. And unless we have a counter narrative, you are passively, even if unintentionally, participating in that narrative.
Right, right, right. I think about James Baldwin in The Fire Next Time talking about why is it that white people respond so often to fear, anger, and guilt when you talk about whiteness and label that, not as, again, a skin tone, but as an idea, as a narrative. And he says, because you are, I'm paraphrasing, because he says it better, because you're pressing on someone's identity. You're
Exactly.
requiring them to reconcile with something, or Ta-Nehisi Coates' language of the people who believe they are white, right?
Yes,
Like it is a belief. No one's speaking of skin color with this.
that's right.
It is an idea. It is a myth. It is a narrative. It's an identity. And that doesn't mean it's not important. It is incredibly significant, but yet it means something and has done
That's right.
something. I want to move towards some Q&A, but I want to ask one more thing before we get to it. We might say more of this later, but your newsletter footnotes, you talked about not speaking too often on matters of the criminal legal system, even though so much of what you talk about is right there beside it. It's definitely deep in those areas. But yet you've been to Parchment. You've
Yeah.
been in
Yeah.
these spaces. You've seen these things up front. What is Parchment? How did that affect you? And how is that an instance of bringing the past crashing into the present for us?
My ambition is to speak circumspectly about these matters because there are experts like you, there are practitioners, there are policy experts, and I'm not one of them. I do have personal experience with the carceral system. As a graduate student, I was a teaching assistant for several semesters in both Parchman Penitentiary, which is now known as Mississippi State Penitentiary, again, sanitizing its history,
Mhm.
um, and Marshall County Penitentiary, which was a max security prison. So I worked in Unit 25 at Parchman, which was actually in the pre-release program. These are folks who are on their way out,
Mm.
but in the meantime, they were taking classes through a program called the Prison to College Pipeline Program out of the University of Mississippi. And it was just so eye-opening. I don't know if listeners have ever been inside a prison. It is absolutely terrifying.
Mm.
It is chilling. It is this very impersonal, institutional construction, cinder block everything, low quality, low standard everything, um, fences 20 feet high, with barbed wire, spotlights, people armed with guns everywhere you look, plexiglass, metal detectors, all of that. Just the process of entering into the prison, even as an outsider, where you literally have to strip off all your metal, pens, anything you're carrying, way worse than anything you experience at a TSA checkpoint.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost a process as you enter the physical building of dehumanization. And I'm just a visitor.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine being incarcerated and day after day in the conditions we encountered. This is Mississippi, y'all, known for its heat. And so often we would walk in, AC's out again. There's big industrial fans that they wheel out and put into the hallway. Just nothing but blow hot air from one end of the hallway to the other. Simple things like lunch was routinely an hour or two late. And when they got their lunches, we talk about grown men, and their lunch is like 2 slices of white bread and a piece of bologna and maybe like a fruit cup or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like hardly anything substantial. And that's just the surface stuff that we saw in the pre-release program. This speaks nothing of the day-to-day violence, the dehumanization. It would jar me so much. And the day-to-day staff in prisons, they're doing their best, right? These are not evil, malicious people by and large on staff. What they are is caught up in a system that is completely dysfunctional and dehumanizing in its very sort of character. So there's only so much good you can do within a system like that. But it would jar me so much to hear a prison official call to another human being who happened to be incarcerated, just call them inmates. And it was so deep, not personal. It was so generic. It stripped you of all identity. We're talking about identity before. My goodness, I see how the narrative of whiteness and calling that out might threaten someone's identity. Well, imagine being stripped of your name and being called something that's interchangeable with absolutely anyone else around you. Inmate.
Right.
And how that challenges or deconstructs
Right.
or dehumanizes your identity. So those are the things I encountered in there, among the fact that these were eager students. Like these are people who really realized the power of education. And so they did their work. They asked great questions. They had fun in class. It was an enjoyable educational experience in the midst of the most crushing circumstances. And I understand many of the folks had broken the law. Okay, well, number one, lots of people break the law, but they face very different consequences. We're seeing that play out when we've got people openly threatening the FBI. And it's just like, oh, we're monitoring their social media. Let that be a Black person, right? We know it's different. But then number two, the doctrine of the image of God tells us that no matter what a person has done, they are still made in the image and likeness of God and should be treated as such. There's so much in the carceral system that is just cruel. Well, these guys broke the law, so they don't get this, they don't get that, they won't, it was just stark to experience that firsthand.
I think about Brian Stevenson and you're more than the worst thing you've ever done.
Yes,
I think of others who have said that they would describe the carceral system not as dysfunctional, but as functional for its purpose. In the sense that it's not broken, but it is doing what it is meant to do. And it given a certain condition, right? If that condition is, or that goal is dehumanization, and if that goal is punishment, it is entirely successful. The question that all of this hinges on is, what is it that we want done to others? What is our posture towards harm? Do we believe that punishment is transformative? Do we believe punishment brings a balance to these scales of justice? Because when harm is done, absolutely there's an imbalance. But what is it that brings that balance? And a person's answer to that will build a new criminal legal system or maintain the one that we have.
That is a powerful way to put it. Yes.
I want to take a couple questions from some people because they've had some big insightful things that they've asked in the Q&A. So Andrea Ball has asked, She said, do you think the false belief that we would have marched during the civil rights movement can be traced to the sanitized version of history we've been taught in schools and the media?
Yes, it can, for sure, because we seldom we focus on the big events and the outcomes. So we'll focus on the March on Washington and the passage of the Civil Rights Act in 1964. We won't necessarily talk about how one of the big ways that got passed was the assassination of Kennedy.
Mm,
And the will that LBJ was able to mobilize to get the Civil Rights Act passed, as well as his willing and dealing to make it happen. We'll talk about the letter from Birmingham jail, but we won't actually talk about the fact that King had to write that letter on scraps of paper, wasn't allowed to call home, had to get outside help, and this is Easter weekend that he's
mm,
incarcerated. So we tend not to talk about the consequences, and in my latest book I'm trying to do that. I'm focusing on people who confronted racism, but I also want people to count the cost.
mm,
Progress is not cheap or easy in this
mm,
country, especially along racial lines. And if you stand up, so I began my first book, The Color of Compromise, with the story of Charles Morgan Jr., who's a white lawyer in Birmingham who stood up and denounced the bombing of 16th Street Baptist Church and the killing of 4 little
mm,
girls. What I didn't say in that was what happened after. He got ran out of the city. He got ran to the north. He could never come back to Alabama because he gave a speech, y'all. Like he didn't boycott or protest or anything. He gave a
mm, mm,
speech. And we would be naive to think that a similar backlash would
mm.
not await us when we take a real stand. And by the way, if you haven't experienced that backlash, but you call yourself an ally or an advocate for racial justice, maybe it's because we haven't taken a strong enough stance to elicit a response. You're not a threat.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Another one that relates to this, Grading Jones was saying, referencing earlier when you talked about these people don't know me at your church. He asked, how can we help white evangelicals truly know BIPOC while not forcing the relationship and disrespecting the agency of people of color who may not perpetually get coffee with white people?
Very good. Because the burden often falls on people of color to quote
Mm,
unquote educate white people. I
mhm,
think it's some of it's low hanging fruit. Like literally, it's a book study.
mm,
It's let's get together and watch this documentary or watch it on your own and let's talk about it, whatever. Like these are conversations that white people can and must have among themselves. The harder part is many times these folks exist in an information bubble. And so they're getting all of their information from really, really biased and bad. I won't even say biased because everybody's biased, but
mm,
really bad news sources that aren't
mhm.
even reporting the news. They're not even reporting accurate facts in many cases. And so the question is, how do you sort of disrupt that a little bit, right? They're not going to switch from Fox News to MSNBC, right? But can you
Mhm,
throw a little Reuters or AP in there? Can you throw a
mhm,
little, NBC or USA Today kind of
mhm,
stuff in there to mix it up a little bit? Don't
mhm.
ask them to go cold turkey on what they're consuming right now, but say, can you add a little bit to it? It's almost
Yeah,
like
yeah,
not to infantilize people, but it's like if you want a child to eat something, you don't just replace like Skittles with broccoli. It's like, you can have a few Skittles, but you actually have to have this and this and this too, right? Something
right,
like that.
right. It's you stair step. Absolutely. Well, the former history teacher in me was singing when you said that we're all biased, right? And that's key. Bias is not necessarily bad. The
That's
question
right.
is, do you know that you're biased, and do you know what that bias is?
That's right.
Is that
That's right.
lens something that is bringing clarity, or is that something that's weighting something away from what is true? I want to give you a second to talk about how can people follow you, engage you, keep up with your work? What are some of the best spaces? And also, we'll send out an email with a recording of this and links to anything that you mentioned to everybody who's registered. But how can people keep up with you?
So my newsletter is the best way, jamartisby.substack.com. I'm not yet completely comfortable with explaining to people why it's so important. But I think within the context of this conversation, maybe it'll make sense. There are very few institutions, particularly Christian ones, where someone like me could feel the freedom to say what I think needs to be said around race and still keep a job. So I've gone the independent route as for now. That may change in the future, but for now, something like my newsletter is the way I make ends meet. And so I would encourage folks to check it out for free, jemartisby.substack.com. If you read 2 or 3 articles, you find them helpful, go ahead and make the commitment and become a paid subscriber. That really helps me. We just did a video teaching series called Those Meddling Kids, Unmasking the Anti-CRT Crusade in Christian Higher Ed. It's been phenomenally received. The content is great. The guests are incredible. If you want to see more projects like that, support by becoming a paid subscriber at the newsletter. Also, my books, we got 3 of them so far, working on number 4. Go ahead and buy those. Also, book me to speak. For lack of a better term, I've been blacklisted by some institutions, namely Christian ones, but maybe not at yours. And it can be corporations. Anything I do has application in secular or non-Christian spaces as well. So it doesn't just have to be a religious space. So do that. And then, of course, like my co-host on Pass the Mic says, you can follow me on social media. Follow at your own risk at Jemar Tisby on Twitter and Instagram.
Great. Let me highlight one thing that you and I are doing in a bit, and then we'll wrap up. So September 22nd, you and I and Joya Aaron Thornton, who works at the Southern Center for Human Rights, are doing an event. It's a conversation with you and some others around matters of justice, especially the criminal legal system, and especially and ultimately the death penalty. And so we're calling it Reform, Race, and Religion, a conversation with Jemar Tisby about the church and justice. And so it'll be September 22nd, it's a Thursday from 6 to 7:30 Eastern time. And if you register for this webinar, I'll make sure to send you all out a registration link once we get all of that up. But it will have various forms of art. It's going to have an attorney of a man who's on death row in Texas share about his art, how he makes his own paints and paintbrushes, and how he has arted his way for a season at least out of depression and the role that's played in his spiritual journey. And we'll ask some really pointed questions about what is it that the church can do? How can we as Christians, in response to the gospel, love others? And how does that love manifest itself to those who are within the system, the criminal legal system, those who have been, or those who are proximate to it? So I'm really excited about that event. And people, again, on this call will be able to hear more about it. We'll make sure you get the info.
That sounds phenomenal. I cannot wait. Thank you so much for this conversation.
Absolutely. Let me pray for you real quick, Jemar, and then we'll close out and head out. Father, thank you for this time where we've been able to talk, to learn, to grow, to be stretched. We pray that you would bless all of us as we leave this place. May we love those within our professions, love those within our households. We pray a unique blessing upon Jemar, that you would give him words of truth, that you would give him courage and a prophetic voice into the spaces where he's invited, and wisdom to move into the spaces where he's not. And ultimately that you would give him peace, and may his work flourish for your glory and for our good. We ask these things in your son's name. Amen.
Amen.
All right, Jemar, thank you so much, friend. Always good to see you. Always good to talk with you, and appreciate you coming. All right. Bye-bye.